Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. This is our fourth SAAB webinar this year, and we are very privileged to have Professor Bob Scholes talking to us. Before I briefly introduce him, I'd just like to ask that you remain muted until at the end when you want to ask a question. I'll need you to indicate in the chat that you want to ask a question, please, as I cannot see the raised hands. I'm not the host. You don't need to write out your question, just indicate that you wish to ask one, and I'll request you to do so. And then, as I've mentioned in the chat, please note if you want any CPD points for this, and our council will organize that. Our secretary and our council will arrange that. But we do need your full name, please, so that we can submit that request for you. Right, then, without much further ado, let me introduce Bob to you very briefly. Thank you, Bob, for agreeing to give us this webinar today. Bob is the director of the Global Change Institute at Wits University. He's also a distinguished professor of systems ecology. I won't go through his long list of accolades and participation in global entities. You've been able to read that in about the speaker paragraph that we circulated. But just to say that Bob also lectures at undergraduate and postgraduate level at Wits. And it's wonderful to have him talking to our SAAB community now. Bob always has very interesting insights, and we're really looking forward to your presentation today. So thank you, Bob. If you'd like to go ahead and share your screen and then proceed with the presentation.
Thank you very much, Glynis, and it's a great pleasure to speak to my SAAB colleagues this afternoon. I am going to do some screen sharing now, and then I will turn off my video just to conserve a bit of bandwidth. And if you can hear music in the background, it's not a heavenly choir. I'm in a rather noisy office, and a large party has just started up across the road, and I hope you won't let that disturb you. So I am just sharing a screen here. There we go. And if that screen is shared, I am going to stop my video and commence with the lecture. So it's always been a pleasure to me to be called a botanist, though I sometimes think I'm a bit of a fake. It is true that I got my PhD from a department of botany, but I've always, ever since I was an undergraduate, thought of myself primarily as an ecologist who just happened to study in a botanical department because that's where the teaching was best in my field. And in addition to being an ecologist, I'm a particular sort of ecologist. I call myself a systems ecologist, which means someone whose primary focus is the study of ecosystems. Now, ecosystem ecologists worldwide are a much rarer breed than ecologists in general. South Africa has always been extraordinarily good at generating ecologists. I've often wondered why, but we, produce many of them, and they operate at a very high level of standing internationally. But amongst those, not all of them are ecosystems ecologists. Many of them are ecologists studying organisms within a particular ecosystem. And that distinction is really the substance of most of what I am going to talk to you about this afternoon. So I'm trying to move down here. For some reason, there we go. So we're all familiar with the sort of work that ecologists do out in the field, working on a patch of vegetation, digging holes in the ground, measuring things within quadrats. And that's how I started my life as well, you know, at Nailsflay in particular, and doing my PhD, working at this kind of scale. But over time, I started to work at this scale, the whole world. And that is an ecosystem as well. And there are many ecosystems in between the scale of the whole world and the patch, which classically ecologists work at. And so many young people ask me, how did you make the transition from, you know, working at that more familiar scale to working at this enormous scale? And I reply that it, in fact, was in principle not that difficult. The kind of concepts and processes are really similar at large scales as they are at small scales. You just have to use different methods, and the numbers are much greater. And the core of the problem, if you like, is that you can't simply take what you measure at small scale and multiply it by a big area multiplier to get what happens at large scale. And I am going to explain why that is in the remainder of this lecture. So if we look at the history of science, you know, since the Enlightenment, where really, you know, modern science took off, the main mode of investigation has been reductionism. In other words, you take a complicated problem that its answer is not immediately apparent, and you break it up into smaller parts, which are simpler, and you solve them one by one, holding all equal. And there's nothing wrong with that process. It has delivered enormous advances to humankind over the past several hundred years. But it's important to remind ourselves that even right at the beginning of that Enlightenment process, great thinkers such as Isaac Newton reminded us that, in fact, there were two processes needed. You needed to do what he called analysis, which was that reductionistic approach to trying to understand how a complicated problem worked. But then you also shouldn't forget to put that back together again. And he called that synthesis, so that you can see in the end what you got by adding together these little bits that you've disentangled comes out to what you see at the original scale. And that's the only way of checking whether, in fact, your understanding is complete. And that whole, you know, sort of zooming in and getting smaller and smaller was the sort of main thrust in you know, the key disciplines of biology and other parts of science, you know, up until certainly, you know, up until the present time, but especially up until the 19th century. And this idea, you know, that there was a scale greater than the organism really came to the fore in the late 19th century. And the word ecology was coined by Ernst Haeckel in 1866. And a slight discomfort with the fact that we couldn't simply just assume that reductionism by itself was a sufficient methodology was raised by Jan Smuts, in fact. First of all, when he was a young undergraduate at Cambridge University and he wrote a term paper on this problem, he was advised by his mentor to file it away because it would get him into trouble. And that is an indication of just how dominant this approach of always going downwards in scale and in greater detail had taken over the whole process of science. But then in a period when he was out of work because he was in the opposition rather than the Prime Minister of South Africa, he revisited that old essay and wrote a book called Holism, which created the term that we use for this process of seeing the entirety of the system rather than just its pieces. And the difference between the result you get isn't magic, although a lot of people accused both Smuts and the people who followed him of indulging in magical thinking. It's actually that it results from the interactions between things. And when we study things without those interactions and without reconnecting them, we are not getting the full system of the full behavior of the connected up system. And in fact, the term ecosystem, as opposed to the term ecology, in other words, the idea that there was this thing acting as a system greater than the scale of the organism, was only coined by Arthur Tansley in about 1935, maybe 10 years after Smuts had published his holism book. And the theory that underpinned how systems work differently from individualistic parts really only started after World War II in the 1950s. It was called cybernetics. And when we see a phrase like taking an ecosystem perspective now used increasingly, what exactly do we mean? So we see it arising, in two of the big domains that I work in. For instance, in the Convention on Biological Diversity, has resolutely been focused at a species level. We have endangered species, and we have, conventions on the trade of endangered species, etc. Almost all of the activity in both the public mind and in the literature is focused around the organism and population. But increasingly, people have found that you can't solve the biodiversity crisis by looking solely at that level. And so they've been promoting something called an ecosystem conservation approach. Similarly, within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, we're seeing the emergence of ideas such as ecosystem-based adaptation. What exactly do we mean? So one meaning is considering biology at scales far above that of the individual organism, or even at the scale of the population. And typically the sort of ecosystem scale starts at the scale that we call the landscape. And increasingly we're talking about these escapes, because really the same logic applies in aquatic systems, in freshwater aquatic systems, or in the ocean. So instead of always saying landscapes, seascapes, and waterscapes, we just use the word scapes. And I like to talk about this concept of the landscape really as the same concept as an ecosystem, but kind of writ out on the surface of the world, which makes it much more easy to grasp, whereas the ecosystem concept sounds very theoretical, and people immediately raise the question, well, this is a very vague thing. How do I manage it? How do I get my hands around it? Where does it start? Where does it end? Whereas when you actually paint it onto the surface of the earth or the surface of the ocean and its depth, it becomes really quite concrete. And usually you can point out it is no less or better, bounded and defined than many other concepts, such as the organism, which we take for granted. And then the second meaning when we talk about taking an ecosystem perspective is that we pay particular attention to the systemic effects. In other words, the effects that arise because of things being part of a system. In other words, the things that are based on interactions, and in particularly on certain types of interactions called feedbacks. In other words, not interactions which just go in one direction, but one that eventually come back and alter the thing that is causing the interaction in the first place. And the consequence of those interactions and the scale interacting with one another is this phenomenon that we call emergent properties, which are properties which would be impossible to predict from the properties of the things themselves. You have to have the things themselves plus their interactions in order to get these emergent properties. And often we don't have the knowledge to do that. And so it's better to actually study the phenomenon at its scale of emergence. And we can worry in some senses about how it came to be later on. And that includes ideas such as resilience and functional measures of how the system is working, rather than taxonomic measures. In other words, we're much more interested in how things are operating than necessarily what they are. And this is one of the sort of key tools which systems ecologists use. It's called a stomal diagram. And what it does is it shows the characteristic space and time domain where different phenomena occur. And so, much of ecology and biology takes place at the scale of the individual organism. And a lot of it, because of reductionistic approaches, takes place at even finer scales here, down at the scale of the physiology going on within an organism. But many of the issues we are being challenged to respond to in the world today are up in this corner over here. They unfold over periods of decades to centuries, and at scales from multiple kilometers, the landscape, up to the whole world. And the problem is, how do we get from an understanding at this scale here of the organism up to that scale? Now, we can upscale. We can do that in a couple of bounds. It would be nice to do it in one bound, but in fact, often that's not possible because it's too many orders of magnitude, and we have to do it in a couple of steps. And the problem is that each of those steps comes with it a great deal of uncertainty and the addition of many new phenomena. And so often it's better to actually study the problem at the scale at which it manifests, rather than trying to make these on faith up from much finer scales. Which then raises the question, why do systems behave more than just the sum of the parts? Why can't I simply take what's going on in a 1 hectare patch and multiply it up by a large number to get at what's going on in the world? Or even, taking into account the heterogeneity and add up all the bits of savannas and all the bits of grasslands and all the bits of forests and all the bits of ocean, various types. Why don't they then come to then what I see at the global scale? In some instances, they do. Those processes are conserved with scale, but in many instances, they don't. And let's explore some of the reasons why not. One of the key ones is the feedbacks that occur when you put things next to each other and engaging with one another. And those feedbacks can either have amplifying effects. In other words, when there's two things working, the outcome is not, 1 + 1 = 2. It's, 2 point something. It's greater than the sum of them. But it can equally have an equivalent effect, which is reduce the outcome, a buffering effect. And these are the results of either positive feedbacks or negative feedbacks. Also, commonly when you're looking at systems, you can have this phenomenon of multiple stable domains, and you can have if you have multiple the outcome at a systems level doesn't necessarily have a single possibility. Mathematically, we can show this to be true for any system of even moderate complexity. The moment you get more than about 3 things interacting, and especially if their interactions are non-linear, in other words, they have these amplifying or buffering outcomes involved, then we automatically get multiple stable domains, and we shouldn't be surprised about that. That's actually also true at the scale of the organism, just we take it for granted. Not all organisms, for instance, look exactly the same, even if they're from the same species, or behave exactly the same. They're manifestations of a particular stable domain, okay, which this set of interactions results of at a particular time. And if you have multiple stable states, then you can also have these phenomena called thresholds, which are really important, because that's why when things don't scale smoothly, if you suddenly reach a certain level, they can flip into a different state. And a consequence of that is this apparent indeterminism. So when we run models which include all these fine-scale processes, even if we included all the possible interactions and knowledge, we end up with what looks like a chaotic result. it isn't, in fact, a chaotic result. It just looks like a chaotic result. And its indeterminism is actually because of the bifurcations between those multiple stable states that I introduced above. If you happen to be just one side of the threshold, it'll go one way. If you happen to be just the other side of the threshold, it'll go in a different way. And the problem is that our starting conditions, when we start our models, have a tiny bit of error in it. And it can be an infinitesimally small amount of error, just measurement difference, and as a result, we can get completely different results. And this is, the famous analogy of this is that a tropical storm is caused by the flap of a butterfly wing somewhere. That's an analogy. That's not, in fact, what causes tropical storms. But the point is that a very, very small perturbation, a very small uncertainty at the point when you start modeling this way can lead you to radically different outcomes. And because that happens repeatedly, you get an apparently chaotic outcome. There's a solution to that. It's not true chaos. The solution is actually to jump up a scale, and then it resolves itself due to the appearance of emergent properties, which then take over really at that scale, and they can be perfectly predictable rather than chaotic and indeterminate. And so emergence is really that phenomena become apparent at particular scales. An example might be that the phenomena, the processes which underpin the appearance of clouds are actually determined at molecular and very, very tiny microphysical scales in the atmosphere, but the cloud only appears at a scale of, let's say, a kilometer or so, and at a time scale of several hours. We don't actually have to necessarily know how that emerges for us to study clouds and to classify clouds and to determine how they will behave and how they will propagate over time. It's nice to have that underlying understanding, but we can study them at that scale as well. A common phenomenon, within systems is multiple causality. So unlike when you're going reductionistic, what you're trying to get is the cause, because you're holding everything else constant. But the moment you start putting things together, typically there are many causes for anything that you observe. And a consequence of that is this issue of unintended consequences. It's also a consequence of that is concatenated change. You do one thing and something else completely happens, or else you do one thing and a whole sequence of things unfold. So there have been, apart from these sort of philosophical questions and need to solve problems at large scale, there have been some really important technology push factors involved over the past 30 or 40 years in particular. One of the big complaints by people who are wedded to a reductionist approach is that reductionism is a deductive approach. You're breaking things down into their causal elements, whereas holism is an inductive approach, and induction is weaker than reduction, than deduction, and therefore this is fundamentally a much fuzzier way of doing things and not really science. But that experimental divide disappears if you can study the system or manipulate it at whole system level. In other words, instead of trying to study things at the scale of the organisms and then add them up together and deduce how they will behave as an ecosystem, you can study them as a whole ecosystem. Now, the limitation to that in the past has just been the scales involved. How do you impose a treatment at the scale of several kilometers? We first started to actually conceive of doing that in about the 1960s, partly because of the thinking processes that had gone on in the field of cybernetics, but also because of the development of new techniques to do that. And the key example was the International Biophysical Year, which actually took a whole decade in the 1960s and led, amongst other things, to the establishment of the first ecosystem scale research programs in South Africa in the mid-70s, of which the first one was Nailslay, the Savannah Ecosystem program, but then it proliferated as the success of that approach was seen into the other ecosystems as well, the fynbos and the forests and the grasslands. And what's happened, especially over the period when satellites and automation and computation have been available, is massive accelerations in the sensors that we need and the computational power to deal with them, which can make whole ecosystem scale observations. And a classic example is satellites, which can, observe the functioning of ecosystems all over the world, at scales of hundreds of meters or even kilometers. But we see many, many other examples as well. For instance, drones at a smaller scale, or ecosystem sensors such as eddy covariance systems, which can measure net primary production at the scale of a whole landscape, instead of some poor grad student had to going around and clip thousands of plots and dry them and weigh them and add them up. And in fact, this ability to massively oversample has taken away one of the key constraints to studying ecosystems. When I was a grad student, it often took, weeks to get the data that you needed at one patch. And as a result, your experiment, even if you had replication, would only consist of 2 or 3 replicates, and the statistics then became really dodgy and weak. And we had all these very, very fancy statistical approaches we used to try and squeeze the last ounce of discriminating power out of that. But nowadays, in fact, often we can measure the entire universe. And I don't mean that in the cosmological sense. I mean that in the statistical sense. We can actually sample the entire population instead of just subsamples of it. And that means that increasingly those statistical, limitations and problems like pseudo-replication go away. But it introduces a different set of statistical challenges. And those are the challenges of you've got such a mountain of information. How do you detect pattern within it? And so if we look over the span of my career, when I started, back in the mid-80s, my PhD, generated probably, somewhere in the region of 3 kilobytes of data. 10 or 20 years later, a single day of my ecosystem flux measuring devices at Scholes would generate about 6 megabytes in a day. And these days, the Earth system models, which we routinely run here at the Global Change Institute, will generate 12 terabytes of data. And if you work out the statistics of that curve, that in fact has something like a 14-month doubling time, which is faster than Moore's law. Moore's law has an 18-month doubling time. In other words, there's not just an increasing computation involved in here. It's a result of the sort of increasing interactions and the increasing complexity of the systems that we are studying. So that leads me on to the question of what is it that a 20th century ecologist needs to know? In other words, what should we teaching our students at undergraduate level and postgraduate level? It certainly includes many of the things that we have taught them in the past, but there are other things which have to be on their horizons as well. And the first is they need to learn big data analysis techniques. So this is not only the statistics you would apply to big data, but in fact, just the confidence to deal with terabyte scale data sets and how do you manipulate them and what do you do and not to be scared of them. But increasingly exploring those data sets is not possible to do by an unaided human being. And so we have to use these machine learning and artificial intelligence techniques. Secondly, as we now realize that there's not an ecosystem in the world anymore which is not strongly influenced, even dominantly influenced by its human components, so we have to work in the area of ecological systems. And that involves us in a whole different approach for data collection. It's no longer the ecologist by themselves out there in some protected area, working in the wild, but in fact working with many other disciplines and working closely in conjunction with the people who are actually going to be using the outputs. And that means the co-production of knowledge. And that requires us not necessarily that we know the details or that we know how to do everything that those other disciplines do, but we have to develop trust that they know best how to do that, and we have to learn how to interface them. And really what that requires us to develop is, as well as the communication skills which are drummed into us as students right from our first year, we have to learn some listening skills. And that has taken me a lifetime, and I'm not sure that I've fully succeeded. And I wish that I had been taught to do that much earlier on in my career. And then there's a whole corpus of knowledge, which we now call Earth systems science. And so, beyond the, the standard bits of ecology we need to learn, we also need to learn systems analysis techniques, and in particularly complexity theory, which is not the same as making things complicated. It's how these phenomenon emerge out of systems where there are lots of linkages and nonlinearities. There's also some techniques that we can learn, and some of the dominant ones are things like biogeochemistry, which is if you like, the physiology as it plays out at global scale, and things like environmental physics, which is, for instance, controls the climate at these scales. And in order to engage with that, typically you need some with advanced instruments. You simply can't tackle these problems, knowing only how to operate a pair of binoculars and a quadrant. You also need to know that such things exist as flux towers and floating instrument platforms in the ocean and satellites. So if I was to conclude with some advice to scientists simply entering the area of biology and ecology at the moment, I would say that if you are motivated to make a difference in a world which is facing some severe problems which relate to the area of ecology, you need to be able to work at scales where those ideas can get traction. And typically, the decisions that are made in response to those problems are taken at national jurisdiction, or even at higher jurisdictions, or at the very least at sort of whole landscape scale. And so you need to be able to cast your findings at a scale where those policies and those decisions can pick them up. And that means not getting into some argument about whether we should take top-down approaches, these helicopter views, or bottom-up approaches, going to the details and adding them up, but you actually need to be able to take both of those. And you need to be able to move effortlessly up and down that hierarchy in order to understand, to get a confident understanding of, in fact, how the whole system and its parts work. And as we move into this area of transdisciplinarity and working with other epistemologies, you need to be proud of the scientific method. The scientific method, in my understanding, has some unique properties in that it's not the only way of knowing things, but it is the way which in the long term is one of the most reliable. So we need to be proud of our science background, but we also need to understand that it has limitations, that many of the things that go on in the world are values-based rather than objectively based, and that those values matter when you start talking about coupled human social systems. And therefore, we need to be open to other epistemological traditions, whether they're in the human sciences or whether they are radically different, such as, for instance, wisdom-based approaches, such as faith-based approaches or indigenous knowledge approaches. That doesn't mean that we have to accept those, without any questioning whatsoever, but they can enrich our understanding and certainly help a great deal in the implementation of our scientific understanding of how to solve the problem. And that's the point where I'm going to leave you and open up for questions.
Great. Okay. Start video. Thank you, Bob. Thank you very much for that very, very insightful and interesting presentation. Quite challenging to think about trying to train students to move from specifics to that very, very global view. And I liked on one of your slides, you had a point, you had along the side there, you had a little banner saying learn, enable, and change. So we have quite a few educationalists joining us today. And if you were to say to them, how do you begin to get students to see that synthesis view that would enable them to move to a systems approach? What would be the main qualities, the main things that you would want to promote in their learning journey?
So I have struggled with this a lot, and I used to think it was just because, you know, I couldn't see clearly, and so I would get together with other people who tried to train people to take a systems view rather than a solely reductionist view, and they all expressed the same frustration. So we must all be uniquely stupid, or else there's something, you know, going on there, and we, you know, amongst ourselves, have come to the conclusion that different people's brains are actually wired slightly differently. And I'm not going to get into whether that's from birth or whether it's an acquired pattern. But it seems that some people tend to think more about the connectedness of things, their interrelationships, rather than, you know, the things. And that, you know, approach comes naturally. And it shows up in certain ways. You know, the people who see the connectedness of things often immediately resort to drawing a diagram to explain something rather than explaining it as a linear sequence of observations. So having said that there might be some limits, you know, to just how much we can get people, you know, to see things in a systems way rather than in a separate way, it is my belief that in the same way that not everyone can aspire to be a Olympic athlete. We can all learn to run faster or do things better than we currently do. So I believe that you can teach people, even those who don't naturally see the world that way, how to see it better. And certainly people who do naturally see it that way, to give them learning styles and learning approaches which allow them to use that to the maximum instead of forcing them into this reductionistic approach, is very much like encouraging people who naturally work with their left hand to do so rather than forcing them to be right-handed. I remember the enormous sense of relief I had when I went into my first ecology lecture as a second-year student, and feeling suddenly like I'd arrived, you know, at home. That suddenly there were people who were seeing the world in the same way as I naturally did, but had been forced to suppress it in the past. So, you know, I think that there are techniques and approaches and learnings that you can give to all students, but you shouldn't necessarily expect all of them to pick them up and run with them. In the same way as any other training that we give, you know, forms part of your background without necessarily forming your everyday practice.
Good, thank you. So if anyone else has a question, please could you put it in the chat, and then we can ask Bob to answer it for you. Well, not writing out the question, just indicate that you would like to ask one. Or just go ahead and ask. If you can switch on your microphone, you can go ahead and ask.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Bob, it's Karen here, Karen Essler.
Hi, Karen.
Hi, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you.
Pretty good. Okay, thanks. And thanks very much for a great talk. I'm interested to know how, if we're encouraging our younger scientists to sort of broaden out in this way, how does it work with their careers in terms of gaining visibility? Because it seems to me that the National Research Foundation in the past has been very strong. I mean, maybe it's changing now, but it's been very strongly favoring those sort of the specialist type that sort of, stand on the top of their pile. But when you start navigating across and between piles, your visibility as an academic declines. Now, not everybody's driven by being visible, for sure. But if you want to become a successful academic, I mean, I guess it's around, how we judge ourselves. I mean, I'm thinking of the NRF in this case. So I'm interested to know what your comments are around that.
So certainly there's nothing new in this. When I was a student, there were also pressures to specialize. You had to have, a deep and narrow knowledge because that was the way forward. And that's because of this embedded, kind of a bias towards reductionism within science. I didn't take that route. Not only because it kind of rebelled against my natural tendencies. I wanted to see how things connected up. And that's why I was attracted to the field of ecology in the first place. But also the South African circumstance didn't really allow me to do that. We are not really able to become such narrow specialists here as is encouraged in more densely populated scientific environments. So we were encouraged, to dabble in a bit of this and a bit of that and to solve, big, hairy, real world questions. And as a result, if I had to kind of present my career for getting tenure, in an American university, I would probably be laughed out of court because people would say, "But hold on, you've done all these things. You don't have any depth. You've only got breadth." But in fact, that has really worked to my advantage in the sense that because everyone has focused on being narrow specialists, the skills needed to put the big picture together are an extremely scarce supply. And so that has been really the reason, why I have achieved a certain degree of prominence internationally in those integrative kind of pieces, because I'm able to do that. And that was not just an accident of a time in history. I think the same remains true now. In other words, to borrow a kind of a notion from ecology, there is not one life history strategy which is uniquely successful in any given environment. There are many. And one of the successful strategies in the academic environment is, in fact, to be an integrator or, someone that sees the system rather than the pieces. And that remains true. And especially if your background was in a place like South Africa, it often feels really difficult to compete internationally because we don't have the latest, coolest tools, to dive into more and more detail. But we do have an opportunity to think really broadly and to engage, for instance, with other disciplines and on real world problems in their totality. And you can continue to turn that to your advantage and very, very competitive internationally.
Thanks.
Okay,
so
thanks.
if I was just to add a few more words on international success, some of it is luck, okay, but it's also true that luck comes, to people who take opportunities when they present themselves. I was fortunate to be, kind of a young graduate student just when South Africa was opening up to the world and everyone wanted to interact with us. And I went out and embraced that. And I was able to surf, that wave, which has abated somewhat nowadays. South Africa isn't the only place that people can go to. But the point is that you have to be, if you want to work internationally, you have to go out and work internationally, and you have to have the confidence that you can do so, that you're as good as anyone else, and that you can make a contribution at that scale. And really, that's a step of faith and, in a sense, a step of courage. You know, you mustn't feel shy or scared to do that. The only way to do it is to do it.
Good. Thanks, Bob, and thanks, Karen, for your question. So I'm told that William Bond and then Lesebo would like to ask questions. They have their hands up. So William, if you'd like to go ahead, and then Lesebo after William.
Well,
hi, William.
Thanks very much for the talk. A lot of it made great sense to me, and I must be becoming a systems ecologist, which is very disturbing.
William, you've always been a systems ecologist.
Anyway, I wondered if you could help with your experience. I've grappled a bit with holistic thinking with the Alan Savory grazing system, and then another one is in attempts to understand at a global level the impact of fire on carbon stocks and carbon, the whole carbon cycle. And I struggled to find out how these, you know, the Savory called his system the holistic one. How do you know when you got it wrong? How does he know when, you know, I've blundered and there's something wrong here? And the same was true of the fire story. There was a massive underestimation of the role of fire because the fire models were wrong.
Right.
But how do you find out that, hey, you know, I got something horribly wrong?
So let me start with the sort of Savory appropriation of holism. The first thing I would say is, you know, don't go back and read Smuts and think that the answer is in there. He coined the word, but it's an incredibly impenetrable book. And, you know, sort of the practical side of how you would do that upscaling and whole system approach, you know, we use the word holism to describe it, but you won't really find the techniques in there. They're much more practical than that. And so, you know, the word holism has been appropriated by many people, including Savory, you know, and often they you know, the way they use it actually almost deliberately muddies the water rather than clarifying them. So what I have read Savory's, you know, holistic range management in detail, and I found it a fascinating book because it includes a bunch of things which I say, well, absolutely, you know, that's, you know, I agree with that, and that's normal practice, and we understand very well, you know, while that occurs. But in amongst that is mixed up, you know, a lot of, you know, straightforward kind of anecdotal stuff and some, you know, blind leaps of faiths and some stuff which is just, you know, frankly wrong. And so, you know, how do you tease that all apart? Just because it's all got a flag on called holism on it doesn't mean that it's automatically right, in the same way as something which carries a flag of, you know, this has been scientifically shown is not necessarily right either. It might be some quack science or pseudoscience. So you've got to bring your skepticism, you know, at whatever level of science you look at. And how do you sort out whether you got it wrong or right is the problem of the just so story. You know, so often you can come up with a plausible explanation why something occurred, but its elements might in fact be wrong, or in total it might not work. And there's two ways of addressing that problem. The first is to drop down into the elements and to test them one by one. This is a postulate. Is it in fact correct? Well, then you do a reductionist, you know, kind of study around that, or you try to put it together so it's then operating at a whole system level. You can either do that, you know, through kind of modeling approaches, or you can do it by experiment at scale. So typically, the approach that I take to address that kind of problem, such as raised by the Savory approaches, is something I call triangulation, which means that you try to approach the problem from several different conceptual bases. And you see whether you end up with the with the same answer. So if you're unable to do a fully kind of controlled replicated experiment at the scale of the whole thing. And typically when people have done experiments at whole farm scale on the savory system, they've either been shown not to work or to not do produce results were statistically different from the standard approach at that scale. So if you can't do the experimentation, at least try to get to the answer from several different perspectives and see whether they agree. And I would, say a very similar thing applies to the issue of fire at the global scale. You try to look for multiple constraints. In other words, don't simply, so you do it by, bottom-up addition. Can we close the budget? You also do it from top-down kind of approaches. Say, is the phenomenon in fact sufficient to explain the emergent property of the climate system, or some other metric of it, that is more closely related to that particular fire process. So that's, kind of what I'm getting at is you've got to do these things both top down and bottom up and see that in fact you end up with a answer which is satisfying to both. And at that stage, you provisionally start saying, well, we might be onto something here.
Great. Thanks a lot.
And throughout, you need to maintain your skepticism.
Absolutely. Thank you.
There was a second person who had a question, and I haven't heard it yet.
Sorry, Lesibo, you have a question?
Hi, everyone, and good presentation, Prof. My name is Disawa Mojoji. I come from Lesotho and work for the Department of Environment. I'm a former student at Wits. I was supervised by Professor Ed Widowski. I was doing ecology.
Right.
And I think where I'm getting at is when the presentation started, to me, because I'm also in a transition whereby I think I'm going more into systems ecology. I felt the quantitative view coming. And I was happy when Prof got to the slide where he was talking about what can we do differently to impact this systems thinking in our students. Because I was asking myself, where are people in all this modeling and systems thinking? But then he got to that slide and talked about socio-ecological systems, and then I was happy. And I think that is where we have to be trying to get at, because like now, I trained as an ecologist, but I'm moving to a point whereby I look mostly on harvesting of medicinal plants, but I'm getting to a stage whereby we acknowledge that you cannot solve the problem without making it live by putting people in this biophysical setting. And I think I want to note the point on on accommodating different ways of knowing. For me, that was one wake-up point whereby I'm like, I have to move from my quantitative paradigm and try to realize that there are different realities out there in the real world. And I think that is one way that has helped me to shape the way I think and the way I approach issues. And one last point is, I think it's also about ethics and morals and values of you as a person and your ability to be able to be connected with your space and to be connected with what is happening worldwide. Because like Prof is rightly saying, the kind of problems we are experiencing now, biodiversity, climate change, they need a systems and transdisciplinarity more than we had thought they did. Thank you.
So thank you. That was a nice summary of my talk, but I'm not sure if there was a question in there. So I don't necessarily see the sort of quantitative versus qualitative approaches as being aligned or non-aligned with a systems approach. You can take a quantitative approach within systems, you can take a non-quantitative approach within systems, or you can take both on a hybrid of them. myself, my own history was that I started off being fascinated by these systems kind of phenomena, things like stability and resilience. That was what I really hooked me on this topic. And I got frustrated with the hand waving, the very qualitative, kind of approaches that were applied there. And so my own career, I went almost to the opposite extreme of trying to be observations-based, but observations-based at big scales. And that led me into the field of biogeochemistry, because in biogeochemistry, I wasn't talking vaguely about, this has an influence on that, or a feedback, loop like this, which might lead to a stable regime. I was actually going out there and measuring, the flows of nitrogen in grams per square meter per second, and then seeing how that would, lead to a certain outcome. And it's only much later in my career that I've now, not only that I've matured, but also, in fact, the theoretical underpinnings for doing much of this work has matured mathematically, philosophically, and technologically, so that we then can re-engage with questions which previously we had to be hand-wavy about, and we can do them in a quantitative way. But, that's true for certain parts of the biophysical side of coupled social ecological systems. It's not necessarily yet true for things like human behavior. I don't think that it's impossible that you can take quantitative approaches, or that we will end up with a quasi-deterministic view of human behavior in the future, but we at different stages of evolution there. And that often means that when you work with social ecological systems, you often have to take a much more qualitative approach than we are able currently to take in the biophysical side. And it's and hybrid and coupling those things together, where one is qualitative and one is quantitative, is a challenge. Okay, not impossible. Okay, we can think of hybrid ways of doing this, but at the moment you can't have the same level of kind of quantitative computation running across the entire system.
Okay, thanks, Bob, and thank you, Letsebo. So there's a question from Cherie Dirk in the chat. Cherie
I see that.
PhD candidate from UCT.
So it's a question of really, what's our responsibility to have a voice in these social discussions. And I have always been a believer, first of all, in science outreach. I don't believe that it should be every scientist's job to make sure that the work that they do is available to non-specialists. And so I put a lot of effort into science outreach. And then that grades, quite quickly into taking a position on topics which might be a ostensibly totally objective position. This is what the science says, and here's the evidence, and putting that into public debates. But increasingly, that also requires us to understand the values which underpin that position. Our social sciences, colleagues point out that, essentially no position is completely value-free, and us scientists saying, but this is a scientific position, is in itself a value, and we need to be proud of that. We need to be defensive of that, rather than to say it's just one value amongst others. No, it's a very special value, because it's based on a particular system of knowledge, which is kind of self-correcting and has proved to be very robust. But increasingly, given the circumstances of the world, it's no longer defensible to me to stand on the sidelines of these things which are impacting us and our future, and simply say, I don't have a voice there, that's a political issue, or that's a values-based issue, therefore I can't have any say. I believe that scientists need to go into that space. They do need to understand the difference between taking a information providing role and taking an advocacy role. But that doesn't mean that scientists can't take an advocacy role. Okay, they just need to be clear when they are doing that and where they are beyond kind of, speaking, as in a purely scientific sense, but whether they are actually arguing for a particular outcome. And that's okay as long as you're clear about it, both to yourself and to the people that you're influencing.
Okay. Well, thank you, Bob. And I don't see any more questions. There's a comment from Alana, and I saw your article in the conversation today, Alana. Very interesting. So, Bob, thank you. Thank you very much for your thoughts, for your recollections of your own journey. I'm sure that has helped many people to think about theirs and where they might want to go if they are lucky enough to be at the beginning of their careers. Some of us thought back to our own careers and thought, well, maybe I might have made a choice differently at a stage if I'd known that information. But for everyone, I think that was very, very helpful and useful for those of us, especially involved in training students, and then for the students making decisions.
So I thank you for the opportunity. It's been fun talking to you, and I wish all my colleagues the very best, and especially those who are just starting out in the career and have all these possibilities in front of them and the chance to make a real difference in the world at a time it desperately needs their skills.
Thank you. Thanks, Bob, and thank you for the difference that you've made, and thank you for flying the flag of South Africa so high very often, and also for being an active member of SAAB. Thank you so much. And thanks everyone for joining. Bye-bye.